I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington, and I'm joined now from Chicago by the Democratic governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. Governor Pritzker, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time on what is the 6th of May, 2024, in the middle of the 2024 election cycle. And yet the year that I keep hearing more and more about these days is 1968, another year in which there was a Democratic National Convention held in the city of Chicago, in which there were serious protests happening around that event because of U.S. policy. Of course, circumstances this time around are a bit different. Instead of the U.S. having lost thousands of soldiers in a war we were conducting, instead we're seeing protests over a war that the U.S. is not directly involved in, but is providing support for. I wonder what you make of this comparison between 1968 and the moment we are in now, and what you're bracing for in your state come the convention in August.
Well, let me remind you that we also hosted the 1996 convention here, the Democratic convention that renominated Bill Clinton and Al Gore. And that was a phenomenal convention. You know, we have protests at every convention all over the country every 4 years, both the Democrats and the Republicans. So we expect that there'll be protests this time, just like there were last time 4 years ago and 8 years ago. And back in 1996. And then, as you're saying, you know, 1968 is an awfully long time ago, and a whole lot has changed. So we don't expect anything quite like that. But protests are, you know, they're a normal part of a political convention, and we expect them.
Okay, so you're expecting them, Governor, but perhaps you also have to brace for the unexpected if indeed it becomes necessary to have a response. What effort do you have underway to work with local authorities statewide, perhaps, to address any safety concerns that may be arising of the convention being held? What work is already underway?
Well, we have an extensive security apparatus for this convention. There is really every 4 years now. But let me remind you that starting with the Secret Service and the FBI at the federal level, all the way to the Illinois State Police, our Chicago Police Department, not to mention the Sheriff's Office and the Deputy Sheriffs for Cook County. And then we're actually trading and working with the Milwaukee Police. The Chicago Police are going to help at the Milwaukee Republican Convention this year, and the Milwaukee Police are coming to help us for our Democratic Convention here in Chicago. So it's quite an extensive plan. It's something that the federal government is quite good at. And as you may know, there was a new bill and new funding that was provided, extensive new funding for both conventions for security. So we feel pretty good about where we stand.
All right. Well, on the subject of working with police, obviously we have seen police forces across the country in many different parts have to get involved in what's happening on college campuses, everywhere from the West Coast to the East Coast. And I wonder to what extent your administration is currently advising schools in Illinois that may be dealing with these protests that we are seeing, and what exactly you are telling them as to how they should be conducting themselves.
Well, I think we have a sort of a common understanding at all of our schools in Illinois that, that we need to protect free speech, but not hate speech, and that protests are okay. What's not okay is interfering with the operations of a university, of an academic setting. So, we've seen the protesters out. It's hundreds of protesters, depending on, what school you're talking about. But so far, relatively peaceful. So far, we haven't had a lot of police intervention. There have been one or two circumstances. But to be honest with you, the protests so far have been, the protesters and the protests have been manageable. And, we're watching it day by day. School is almost over for most of our universities, certainly our state universities in Illinois, and we've already had a bunch of graduations. So far, so good.
Well, so far, so good, perhaps in your state, Governor, and yet across the country, what this does seem to be highlighting is an issue within the Democratic Party, perhaps different fractions of it, running into conflict over the questions around Gaza and policy toward Israel. And I wonder, just thinking about party-wide, how you think your party can overcome this kind of strain and tension, especially when it's a question of whether or not these individuals who are protesting are going to be willing to go out and vote for another term for the Democratic president.
Well, let's remember that this isn't just one party that we're talking about. That is to say, we have a candidate, a Democratic candidate for president, our current president, Joe Biden, and then there's the Republican candidate. And I think all the protesters seem to understand that things would be much worse, if Donald Trump were president of the United States. He's irresponsible, he's reckless. We probably already would have been in a wide war if he had been president when October 7th had occurred. So I think that Democrats understand and young people understand. Ultimately, they've got a lot to say about the current situation and they're protesting on campus. But ultimately, I think they'll understand when they go to the polls in November that they really have two choices, and their better choice is to vote against Donald Trump.
Of course, a lot of that will likely be driven by how much money is spent in order to mobilize the voter force and get them out to the polls. And I wonder, Governor, what your own personal plans are in terms of further contributions for this campaign cycle. There's still 6 months between now and the election. How much should we expect you're willing to put forward and where?
Well, I've been a Democrat my whole life, and I've supported Democrats running for office across the country for a long, long time. And as you may know, I founded an organization that's hard at work now called Think Big America that is protecting women's reproductive rights, working to get referenda passed in places like Nevada and Arizona and Florida, Montana, because of what Donald Trump did when he appointed anti-choice Supreme Court justices. We now don't have law of the land that protects women, and so we've got to make sure we work state by state to overturn the very anti-woman agenda that's been put in place by very right-wing and extremist Republicans.
But is there a dollar figure you have in mind to advance those causes, Governor?
Well, already Think Big America, which I've funded, has dedicated millions of dollars to those efforts, and I'm going to continue to do what's necessary here. We live in a precarious moment in the history of the United States. I do believe that democracy is on the line. I also think, very importantly, that working people, working families are going to be hurt by a Trump presidency. And so I think I've got to do whatever I can. I was traveling in Michigan, all over the state, to make sure that people understood what our message is, that Joe Biden is really standing up for working families, and that Donald Trump worked to send jobs overseas when he was president. It's Joe Biden that's been standing up and protecting jobs in the United States and attracting manufacturing back to our shores. So those are messages that I'm promoting personally, and then along with that, protecting freedoms, as I mentioned, through Think Big America. So millions of dollars I've already dedicated.
Well, Governor, you mentioned U.S. manufacturing. I would like to ask you a question in that realm. There is a U.S. steel plant in the state of Illinois. We have seen President Biden come out against the proposed acquisition of U.S. steel by Nippon Steel. We know that the steel workers in Pennsylvania are very much against it. What is your thought, though, on that deal? Could it actually be beneficial to Illinois and the steel workers in your state?
Well, I don't know whether that deal will happen or not. What I know is that the steel workers deserve to have champions standing up for them. I have worked to bring a new company down to that area of our state that can employ at least 500 of those laid off steel workers. I would like very much for all of them to be able to go back to work. So we'll have to see what deal gets worked out here and what the administration will go along with, and frankly, what Republicans will go along with, because we're going to need support from both sides.
Finally, Governor, we've covered a number of different issues with you today, and I sincerely appreciate your time. Another one that could factor heavily into this election cycle is the question of the border and migration, especially when there is a time in which every state is being characterized as a border state. Certainly, Illinois has felt that in the city of Chicago, especially. What further federal assistance do you expect you might receive to deal with the migrant issues you are now facing, if at all?
Well, we've asked for work permits for many of the people that have have been sent here by the governor of Texas, because we have jobs available. We'd like to put everybody to work. We think that's the best way to manage the migrants that have come. And we're doing the best to manage what I would describe as a humanitarian crisis as a result of the Texas governor's mishandling and failure to do what's best for the people who are legally in this country. These are asylum seekers. Remember, the folks who are being allowed into this country have papers. And so what he's doing is trying to sow chaos, the governor of Texas. And he's sending folks to Democratic cities across the nation because he wants to have a political effect. It's political gamesmanship. But we're doing everything that we can to both care for the people who come and make sure that they get jobs. We think that more needs to be done in terms of comprehensive immigration reform. Republicans don't seem willing to come to the table. They walked away from a border security bill that the president was willing to go along with, that Democrats in Congress were willing to go along with. Why did they walk away? Because Donald Trump does not want to solve this problem. It's all politics to him. The reality is that Americans need to have a secure border, and they need to have immigration, and comprehensive immigration reform will get us there.
And we will leave it on that note. Governor J.B. Pritzker of Illinois, thank you so much for joining us today on Bloomberg, sir. We appreciate your time.